Late at night in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, a hush had fallen over the streets, broken only by the rhythmic hum of distant traffic lights cycling from red to green. Jamal Winslow, a seasoned Assistant U.S. attorney, was driving home, his mind pleasantly disengaged from the day's legal battles, focused only on the quiet comfort of his apartment. Then the piercing glare of flashing red and blue lights ignited his rearview mirror. A sigh escaped him. He signaled, pulled over, and calmly reached for his wallet. He hadn't been speeding, hadn't run a light. There was no discernible reason for the stop. Yet, Jamal, a man intimately familiar with the intricacies of law and its occasional perversion, knew better than to expect reason. Two officers materialized beside his vehicle. Officer Kyle Driscoll, a towering figure with a stern military-clipped haircut, stood by his driver's side window. Officer Brent Kessler, leaner but equally imposing, positioned himself near the passenger door. License and registration. Driscoll's voice was sharp, devoid of warmth. Jamal handed over his documents. "May I ask why I was stopped, officer?" Driscoll exchanged a subtle glance with Kessler before responding. "Your taillight's out." Jamal's brow furrowed. It was an obvious lie. His car had just passed inspection, and in the rearview mirror's reflection, his brake lights glowed fully functional. "Are you sure about that?" Jamal asked, his voice deliberately even. Driscoll's expression tightened, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He leaned in. "Sir, step out of the vehicle." A slow, creeping tension coiled through Jamal's limbs. He had prosecuted countless cases where a seemingly routine traffic stop spiraled into something far more sinister. His immediate instinct screamed compliance, but his years of experience warned him that these officers were already initiating an escalation. "I'm not stepping out until you tell me why." Kessler smirked, his hand idly resting on his belt. "Because we said so." Jamal drew a steadying breath. He knew the law. He had dedicated his life to studying, enforcing, and defending it. He knew he was not obligated to exit his vehicle without probable cause. "I'm within my rights to ask why I'm being ordered out of my car." Driscoll's thin veneer of patience snapped. He yanked the car door open. "Step out now." Before Jamal could react, Driscoll seized his wrist, yanking him forward. The seatbelt bit into his chest, digging painfully into his shoulder. "What the hell are you doing?" Jamal barked, instinctively pulling back. Driscoll didn't answer, his grip merely tightened. Within seconds, Kessler had moved to the other side, wrenching Jamal's arm behind his back. The cold, sharp edge of metal handcuffs bit into his skin. "You're resisting," Driscoll stated, his voice chillingly devoid of emotion. Jamal stared in disbelief as Kessler slammed him against the hood of his own car. His heart hammered, not from fear but from a burgeoning, incandescent rage. This was a charade, a carefully orchestrated setup, and they believed they had already secured their victory. But they were about to realize just how profoundly mistaken they were. The courtroom in the East Baton Rouge Parish Courthouse buzzed with the usual routine. Clerks shuffling papers, the occasional cough, the low hum of whispered conversations. But beneath this mundane surface, a different kind of tension simmered. Jamal Winslow sat at the defense table, his posture rigid yet composed. Today he wasn't here as an attorney, he was the defendant. The charges, resisting arrest, obstruction, disorderly conduct, were complete fabrications. Yet, Jamal knew that in this arena, the truth often mattered less than what could be convincingly proven. At the front of the room, Judge Margaret Holloway peered down from the bench. In her mid-60s, she possessed an undeniable presence, a reputation for being firm, uncompromising, and dismissive of anything she deemed nonsense. From the dismissive glance she barely afforded him, Jamal already understood the direction this was headed. The prosecutor, Richard Calloway, moved with an almost theatrical confidence, the kind that comes from knowing the odds are heavily stacked in your favor. He straightened his tie and offered a confident nod to the two officers, Driscoll and Kessler, who sat proudly at the witness stand, their smug expressions betraying their certainty that the full weight of the system was behind them. "Your Honor," Calloway began, his voice resonating through the room, "this is a simple case of an individual escalating a routine traffic stop into a physical altercation with law enforcement." Jamal exhaled slowly, a faint tremor of outrage running through him. The arrogance, the sheer audacity. "The defendant," Calloway continued, flipping through his notes with a flourish, "refused to comply with officers' lawful orders, became aggressive, and had to be restrained for the safety of all involved." Jamal's lawyer, Thomas Rivera, an overworked and visibly weary public defender, shot up from his chair. "Objection. There is zero evidence that my client was aggressive." Judge Holloway waved a hand dismissively. Overruled. Jamal clenched his jaw. That was fast. Rivera sighed but pressed forward. Your Honor, the officers escalated the situation without just cause. There is no body cam footage showing my client acting aggressively because no such footage exists. Calloway smirked. Body cams were not operational at the time of the arrest. But the officer's statements are more than enough evidence. Jamal almost laughed at the sheer absurdity. The officer's word was all they needed. How convenient. Driscoll took the stand first, delivering his well-rehearsed lines with practiced ease. The defendant was combative from the start, he said smoothly. Refused to exit the vehicle, raised his voice, created a hostile situation. Was. Every single word. Kessler followed, nodding along, adding his own carefully crafted falsehoods. He tensed up. We feared for our safety. We had no choice but to restrain him. More lies. Jamal's fingers curled into fists under the table. His entire career had been dedicated to fighting against this kind of blatant corruption, and now he was living it firsthand. Judge Holloway barely bothered to conceal her impatience as she glanced at Jamal's lawyer. Anything else, Mr. Rivera? Rivera hesitated. He knew this judge knew her track record. She wasn't interested in fairness. Still, he swallowed hard and pushed forward. Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Jamal Winslow to the stand. This was it. As Jamal rose and walked to the witness stand, he could feel every pair of eyes in the room fixed on him. Watching, judging, waiting to see if he would break. But he wouldn't. Because what was about to happen would change everything. Jamal sat in the witness chair, exhaling slowly as the court clerk administered the oath. His hands rested lightly on his lap, but inside, a quiet storm was brewing. He wasn't here to defend himself, he was here to expose the truth. Prosecutor Calloway stepped forward, pacing slightly, an unnecessary display of confidence. Mr. Winslow, would you say you complied with the officer's instructions during your traffic stop? Jamal met his gaze, calm and controlled. I asked why I was being ordered out of my car. That's not illegal. Calloway feigned a sigh of exasperation. You refused to exit, correct? I asked why I was being asked to step out, Jamal repeated, his voice unwavering, which legally I have the right to do. Calloway smirked, glancing at the jury as if Jamal's intelligence were an inconvenient obstacle. And after multiple orders you still didn't comply? Jamal held his stare. Because there was no lawful reason to. Calloway turned to the judge, shaking his head as if he'd expected nothing less. Your Honor, it's clear the defendant. Jamal leaned forward, his voice even, cutting through Calloway's sentence. Before we go any further, I should probably disclose something. Silence. Calloway hesitated. Even Judge Holloway looked up, actually seeing Jamal for the first time. Jamal reached into his briefcase. His lawyer, Rivera, tensed, unsure of what was unfolding. Slowly, deliberately, Jamal pulled out his badge, a small, simple rectangle that had, in that instant, become the most potent object in the courtroom. I'm Jamal Winslow, he stated, his voice slicing through the tension like a razor. Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Southern District. The room froze. Judge Holloway's lips parted slightly, her gavel hovering over her desk, unmoving. The officer stiffened. Kessler's knee bounced erratically under the table. Driscoll's jaw went tight. Calloway's face went from confident to ashen. Excuse me? Calloway stammered. Jamal tilted his head. Did I stutter? The air in the courtroom shifted palpably. The jury leaned forward. The stenographer stopped typing. Even Rivera, his own lawyer, looked like he'd been struck by a freight train. You're a federal prosecutor? Calloway's voice wavered just barely. Jamal lifted his ID. That's what this says, doesn't it? And just like that, the entire carefully constructed case imploded. Judge Holloway leaned back, her mouth pressing into a thin, grim line. She knew. If she ruled against Jamal now, if she dismissed his testimony and sided with these officers, this wouldn't just be another forgotten case. It would be a full-blown scandal. The courtroom was no longer just a courtroom, it was a powder keg and Jamal had just lit the fuse. The courtroom held its breath. Judge Holloway's grip on her gavel tightened, but it remained silent. Not yet. She was thinking, calculating. This was no longer a routine case. This was a career-ending disaster waiting to happen. Calloway swallowed hard, his smooth, arrogant confidence having completely evaporated. He turned to the officers, and for the first time, Driscoll and Kessler looked genuinely nervous, their self-assured facades crumbling. Jamal sat there, observing the silent scramble for control. He had witnessed this 100 times before, In hushed boardrooms, intense back-office meetings, in whispered conversations between prosecutors when the wrong kind of case landed on their desks. But this time he was the one who had forced their hand. I wasn't aware of this information, Calloway stammered, frantically flipping through his files like a man desperately searching for an escape hatch. Your Honor, Judge Holloway raised a hand, silencing him. For the first time, her eyes truly locked onto Jamal's. His mere presence was now a threat. A government prosecutor wrongfully arrested, assaulted, and lied about. Had this gone unnoticed, he could have been just another nameless statistic. And she knew it. She turned her gaze to the officers. Officer Driscoll. Officer Kessler. Both men sat up ramrod straight, like children anticipating a scolding. Would you like to amend your statements? Silence. A crack in their composure. Jamal could see it happening. Driscoll's fingers curled into a tight fist around his knee. Kessler looked at Calloway, a silent plea for a lifeline in his eyes. Jamal spoke first before they could answer. Before they answer that, Your Honor, I'd like to request that the court pull the dispatch call logs from the night of my arrest. Calloway flinched. Jamal wasn't guessing, he knew how these things worked. If those officers had radioed in before the stop, their flimsy lie about the taillight wouldn't hold up. If they hadn't, they had violated protocol from the very beginning. Judge Holloway studied him for a long moment. She was trapped. If she denied his request, she would be burying evidence. If she approved it, she would be handing Jamal the final nail in the coffin of the officers' careers. She cleared her throat. Request granted. Driscoll exhaled sharply, his composure finally shattering. Kessler shifted uncomfortably, his jaw clenched. They knew what was coming. Jamal leaned back in his seat, a quiet resolve in his eyes. He wasn't finished yet. Because this case wasn't staying inside this courtroom. It began with a single reporter in the back of the courtroom. A young journalist from the Baton Rouge Advocate, furiously typing on her laptop. Within hours, the story had spread like wildfire. By the next morning, Jamal's name was everywhere. Assistant U.S. attorney wrongfully arrested by Baton Rouge cops. Federal prosecutor exposes corrupt officers in open court. Judge under fire for bias against black defendant who was a government lawyer. The internet erupted. Social media platforms were flooded with clips from inside the courtroom, taken by people who had attended the trial. The pivotal moment Jamal revealed his badge became a viral video, spreading across platforms at an astonishing speed. Cable news stations ran segments dissecting the case's implications. How many others had been railroaded like Jamal, but without the power or position to fight back? But the biggest shift occurred in Baton Rouge itself. Community activists organized rallies. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, demanding accountability. Civil rights attorneys began digging into old cases handled by Judge Holloway, searching for patterns of bias. Then the real blow landed. An anonymous leak. Internal police records, emails between officers discussing how to justify questionable stops, and damning statements from other black drivers who had been pulled over, cited for false violations, then threatened with arrest if they dared to argue. The case was no longer just about Jamal Winslow, it was about a deeply entrenched system that had operated in the dark for years, and now the floodlights were relentlessly shining on it. But the people in power weren't going down without a fight. The backlash was immediate. City officials scrambled, issuing carefully worded statements. The police department announced an internal investigation. A week into the scandal, Jamal noted, a performative gesture he had witnessed countless times, designed to pacify the public without enacting real change. Judge Holloway's office suddenly stopped returning calls. But this time it wasn't enough. The pressure continued to build. A prominent civil rights attorney filed a federal lawsuit against the department on behalf of past victims. Community leaders demanded Judge Holloway's removal from the bench. Protesters refused to disperse. And then the real moment of reckoning arrived. The case was handed over to Louisiana's Attorney General for review. Jamal sat in his apartment watching the press conference on TV. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Calls from journalists, from other lawyers, from people who had been through exactly what he had but lacked the badge, the position, the resources to fight back. This wasn't just damage control anymore. They were running out of places to hide. Judge Holloway knew it. By the time Jamal returned to court for the verdict, her expression had transformed. No more casual disinterest, no more overconfidence. She was staring at a case too big, too public to bury. And she had to decide which side of history she wanted to be on. But would it be real justice or just another calculated move to protect the system? The courtroom was utterly silent, every breath held, every gaze fixed. Judge Holloway cleared her throat, the immense weight of the past few weeks palpable on her shoulders. The relentless protests, the unyielding media scrutiny, the damning leaked files. She had no good options left. She looked down at her notes, but everyone in the room knew this decision was no longer hers alone. It belonged to the public. She exhaled, setting her gavel down softly, a quiet finality in the gesture. After reviewing the evidence, the court finds the defendant. She hesitated, just for a fleeting second, then finally decisively pronounced, "Not guilty." A wave of profound relief washed over Jamal, but he didn't move, didn't react, not yet. Because this case wasn't just about him. The officers sat stiffly, their faces pale. Kessler's hands were clenched, the specter of his career flashing before his eyes. Driscoll, always the more arrogant of the two, leaned forward, a desperate plea forming on his lips. "Your Honor, She held up a hand, silencing him. "The court will also be forwarding all relevant materials to the state attorney's office for further review." That was it. The officers weren't walking away from this. The courtroom erupted, murmurs, gasps, the rapid clicking of reporters' keyboards. For the first time, the system had been forced to turn its gaze back on itself. Jamal stood slowly. His lawyer patted his back, but Jamal's eyes were fixed on the officers, on Prosecutor Calloway, who looked like he'd just lost everything, and on the judge who had spent years dismissing cases like his until she was forced to do otherwise. But most of all, he thought about the people who weren't in this room, the ones who had sat in this very spot before him, the ones who never got to walk free. As he stepped out of the courtroom, cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, people cheered. But Jamal wasn't celebrating. This wasn't a victory in the traditional sense. It was proof of what had always been happening, but only now, with the world watching, had the system been forced to react. And he knew the fight wasn't over, not for him, and certainly not for the countless others still trapped within its gears. He stepped past the flashing lights and into the clamoring crowd, where voices demanded real change. Because one case wasn't enough. And now nobody was looking away. If this story made you think even for a second, then it's time to ask yourself, how many more stories like this are out there? How many people never get their moment in court, their names never make the news, their truth never gets heard? It's not enough to just see injustice. We have to challenge it. So if you believe that real justice means holding power accountable, then share this story. Talk about it. Pay attention. Because the more people who refuse to look away, the harder it becomes for these cases to be swept under the rug. And that's how change begins.